So, today I want to talk about President Biden and the pandemic. When Biden campaigned during 2020, one of his major promises when becoming president, besides literally not being Donald Trump, was that he was going to come in and properly manage and deal with this pandemic. So, I thought it'd be good to take a look at his response so far and see what kind of promises he's made now that he's had a few days to acclimate himself into the office and talk about the logistics of all that. And I want to do this by going over some of the details outlined in his executive orders and just kind of talk about the few areas he's succeeding in. And I think that he has some good ideas in. But mostly, I want to talk about how his response appears kind of underwhelming and has a lot of problems with it. And I also want to focus specifically on his perspectives on education. And then I want to talk about some alternatives that he should be implementing in trying to get this all taken care of and make sure America becomes pandemic free. So, with that said, before I jump right into looking at some of his ideas, I just want to show a very, very brief clip of Biden that he said on January 22nd. And just to give you an idea of where Biden is in all of this situation.
If we fail to act, there will be a wave of evictions and foreclosures in the coming months as this pandemic rages on, because there's nothing we can do to change the trajectory of the pandemic in the next several months.
So there it is. There is every likelihood, from what Biden is claiming, that they will do nothing to change the trajectory of the pandemic in the next several months. I don't believe that there's nothing we can do. I think it's that there's nothing that they are willing to do. And I think that's a key distinction. And with that said, let's actually take a look at some of the things that he has done. So, first and foremost, he has decided to mobilize FEMA. I think this is actually a really good idea. Moving FEMA out as another source of being able to get vaccines into people's arms quicker. FEMA will mobilize thousands of clinical and non-clinical staff and contractors who will work hand in glove with the National Guard and state and local teams to assist, augment, and expedite the distribution and administration of coronavirus vaccines, the FEMA document states. So I think that in general is a really good place to be in. Having another set of hands and another organization on the ground, especially with as disastrous as the response has been, especially as Trump moved things into the Biden administration. A lot of states have been really mishandling this, and having a federal organization or any sort of federal oversight might actually be a benefit and to create some sort of standard. So having FEMA on the ground certainly doesn't hurt the situation, and I think that that's one of the few positives. And one of the places that I think it's really required is in Florida, because Florida has been handling things atrociously, and Ron DeSantis is an actual joke when it comes to managing his state in terms of this whole pandemic. He was just catering to Trump the entire time and has gotten nothing done. So, what else did Biden promise within his executive orders? Well, first was to ramp up the pace of manufacturing and testing. So, where the administration could invoke the Defense Production Act to increase manufacturing, the Biden team has said it identified 12 immediate supply shortfalls critical to the pandemic response, including N95 surgical masks and isolation gowns, as well as swabs, reagents, and pipettes used in testing. That is key and important. There has been a lack of resources, from hospital beds to everything across the board. The fact that he is actually invoking the Defense Production Act outside of the actual vaccine itself is important and key. That act basically says that the government can come in and mandate the manufacture of certain products from private industry in order for the defense and protection of the country. And it's been used in wartime before. Similar processes were done in World War II, but I think the Korean War is specifically when it was mobilized historically. So basically, you have this act that Trump could have been using for the entire year and didn't. And I'm glad to see Biden actually implementing that. And so uh, it further goes on to say we need the money in order to really ramp up testing, which is important to reopening schools and businesses. And where I cringe with this and where I feel horrible about this is I don't think we should be reopening schools and businesses right now. And I will get to that when we talk about the schools. But businesses and schools reopening is not where we should be focusing. Yes, testing is important, but we wouldn't need as much testing if we actually kept things closed and shut down. And I'll talk more about that after. So, another thing that Biden has mandated is requiring a mask while traveling between states. So, the president to influence mask wearing wherever he's legally allowed to, including on federal property and in travel across state lines. An order issued Thursday requires mask wearing in airports and on many airplanes, intercity buses, and trains. So, ideally, this is a good thing. Unfortunately, I don't know how much that's really going to change things because I feel like most bus and train organizations and airports have already mandated these things privately. Furthermore, I do think that the issue of people traveling across state lines has been an issue during this pandemic, but that's only while they're crossing a state line, and it's kind of hard to enforce in their own private vehicles if they're driving from one state to another and they're near a border. And there's been an issue across the board with people traveling from one state to another and infecting people on the other side, while one state is a protected state and one state isn't. So, people bringing the virus back home with them. I've addressed that before in videos, and that's going to keep happening. And I think more importantly, we need an actual federally mandated response. Because this it's lip service, honestly. It's not doing enough. And it's not actually going to stop people from what they're doing already. So, from there, he wants to form better data collection systems. One order calls on the Health and Human Services Secretary and White House COVID-19 Response Coordinator to reevaluate the federal government's COVID-19 data gathering systems and issue reports on their findings. So I think this is important federally that they have a separate accountability system because we know, for example, in Florida, that DeSantis was kind of fudging the numbers, and we know that because of the situation with Rebecca Jones. And I honestly think that if anything else, we should probably have Biden contact Rebecca Jones, even though she's going through all the litigation that she's going through, and maybe even hire her to get her out of Florida and the situation she's in. If you're not familiar, just briefly, Rebecca Jones was a data scientist, is a data scientist in Florida who was working for DeSantis's government and lost her job because she actually tried to report actual data and numbers and then continued to do it privately outside of DeSantis's jurisdiction and got arrested for it. And so really, if Biden wants to get a good expert on the ground to how to manage some of the data, she might be a good person to look into. Just recommendation, throwing it out there. I know it probably won't be adhered to, but something to consider. Especially because previously during the Trump administration, the central databases were in Washington and not in the CDC, and I think things need to be funneled through the CDC again. So the Washington response has just been horrendous. Many states like Florida were horrendous, and Florida's not the only one. I'm just picking on Florida because it happened to be one of the worst, and the Rebecca Jones things happened there. So then Biden wants to establish a health equity task force. Another order creates a COVID-19 health equity task force, which will recommend how to carve out more funding for the parts of the population particularly hit by the virus, analyzing needs by race, ethnicity, geography, and disability, among other factors. So I get where this is coming from, and they also want to try to figure out how to get certain minority populations to actually take the vaccine, because there's been a disproportionate rate between people of color and white people getting the vaccine, which is a broad systemic issue. And I think one factor is that a lot of people of color don't trust the government, rightfully so, not because of the same anti-vax positions that a lot of white people have tended to have, but because there's actually been historic misuse of medical treatment on people of color in this country from the 20s and eugenics all the way through to the present and just treating people really poorly in the medical industry. So I think that while that's all important, a bigger issue than trying to carve up where funding should go is maybe just getting money into people's hands. I think that would also help, but also figuring out how to get some of that money into neighborhoods with people of color and actually, get people on the ground talking about that is important, and we should be addressing that. So, mixed bag, but I'm going to give them this one. So guidance for employers, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration is being told to release new guidelines for employers. I mean, it's a good thing, right? Like, we can say objectively it's a good thing. There needs to be guidelines for employers and something across the board, but without something to mandate that and back that up, it again just kind of feels like another one of those lip service positions. I'm hoping that the agency actually is able to enforce existing rules and improve things across the board in workplaces, because some of the conditions have actually been really horrible. I look specifically at some of the meat packing plants and how Trump basically gave them complete leeway to do whatever they wanted with workers. And I get that you need food during a pandemic, but you also don't have to treat the workers terribly. And you could have funded PPE and actual, tools and resources for essential workers rather than, just giving the business the leeway to do whatever they wanted. And we'll come back to this scion. And then find more treatments for COVID-19 and future pandemics. So the Biden administration is calling on the Health and Human Services Secretary and the Director of the National Institute of Health to draft a plan to support the study of new drugs for COVID-19 and future public health crises through large, randomized trials. The treatments should be ones that can be easily manufactured, distributed, and administered, both domestically and internationally, according to the executive order. So all of this on the surface sounds really nice. It's great. He's going to put out more things. I think we should focus on future pandemics in the future. I think we should focus on the one now. We should be trying to come up with more vaccine possibilities and how to handle some of the mutations that we've seen happen, because we have new strains coming out. And I think it'd be important to try to invest in dealing with that, as well as preventing the spread of this particular virus. Even though I do agree that having infrastructure in the future to handle pandemics and a combination of the type of testing and everything that he's calling for through randomized trials would be a good thing in the future. So I'm not knocking it. It just seems like this is kind of coming a little bit too late. But, again, generally a net gain. And as with the Biden administration, a lot of it is lip service. A lot of it is making things, federally mandated, that some of which were already happening and some of which will provide net gains, albeit small ones. So the major issue I have with all of this is that he has called on the schools to open within his first 100 days across the country. And this comes after the CDC had been pushed by the Trump administration to downplay the sending of students into school buildings and basically said there was no risk. And the Department of Education and Health and Human Services have teamed up to come up with new guidance to open schools. So what goes into this plan? Well, Biden says he wants to open schools again in 100 days. And one executive order directs the Department of Education and Health and Human Services to provide reopening guidance to schools on focusing on masking, testing, and cleaning. A separate presidential memorandum offers reimbursement to schools for purchases of personal protective equipment, PPE, through the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, Disaster Relief Fund. And the thing is union leaders of the, American Federation of Teachers and National Education Association, while they do want schools to open over time and think that it would probably be better for students, the American Federation of Teachers president actually said, this is Randy Weingarten, said that the goal may need to be reassessed depending on how the coronavirus is spreading over the next few months. Experts have warned that the more transmissible variants, including the ones first seen in the UK, could send cases surging again. I also remind people that cases are still up. When we had our first spike, we are nowhere near that level. We are way up still. I'm on board with the goal, but I'm very concerned about this new variant. None of this is done in isolation. So basically, there's a lot of concerns around getting schools open, and the idea of it being in 100 days seems a little bit ridiculous for a number of reasons to me. One, 100 days from, when this is being talked about, from him taking office, puts us approximately, into the what is it? We're in January, so February, March, April. We're talking April into May by that point. Is it really worth opening schools in some areas for a month, maybe a month and a half to have it open? I don't know if that's worth it. It might just be worthwhile to let the year ride out and let schools stay closed and maybe try to focus on a September plan. Or an August and September plan, because I know a lot of school districts end near the end of May, and some places do go through June. But really, is that going to fix everything within 100 days if 100 days puts us into like early May? I don't know. That just seems like it's not really worth the effort on that regard. But in addition to all of that, I know that a lot of people have cited that kids are going to fall behind in terms of education with remote learning. But I think one of the solutions to that, outside of reopening the schools and rushing to get things open and trying to take advantage of the very politically convenient, look what I did in the first 100 days, is to fund programs like what AOC did in her district, where she provided tutors from across the country to children in addition to being able to contact teachers. She put funding in her district so that students could reach out to a certain number of tutors in order to get help on homework and to learn things more and get more one-on-one help. That across the board would be an amazing benefit. And to fund something like that for states or to have a federal mandated program for students would be absolutely fantastic to have. Further, I think people forget that the issue that students are dealing with in schools is not just the fact that they're not in the buildings. It's the fact that a lot of students right now have become babysitters for younger siblings, are in homes where financial situations are not really stable, where people, their parents are dealing with potentially not having medication or food or, struggling with rent, and the stressful environment is transferring down to them. There is a psychological consequence of the oldest siblings having to be micro adults while their parents go to work and basically being caretakers. There is an issue during the pandemic where people are struggling to maintain food and provide it for their children. This impacts children's performance. So if you want to talk about a real way to fix the situation, I think Biden needs to make some serious reforms if he wants to see kids actually get back into any sense of normalcy in going into school situations. And that's not even counting the fact that kids have already dealt with a lot of the situations in like communities of color, especially where they're working alongside school. If you really cared about kids and kids was really the focus in the education issue, then you would have already worked on programs federally for years and pushed for it during the Obama administration for people to be able to keep their kids home and not be put in positions to work. So if you want a more realistic timeline than 100 days, fine. But I think if you really want to push for something like 100 days or even try to remotely try to stop this pandemic with the new strains evolving and everything, you need to take over the economy and put people in the first place above everything else. Stop looking at, oh, we need to open up the economy. We need to open up the economy. We need to open up businesses. You know what? The US has a huge defense spending bill. And in the United States, Defense spending means military contracts across the board. But what it should mean is defending the lives of Americans, of defending the lives of people who live in the United States and who have US citizenship. If you're going to look at it on that nationalistic level, that's the exact minimum of what a defense spending bill should be. So take some of that money and start applying it, but so that we stop having Americans die. It is justifiable to call this part of the defense spending bill because it will save American lives. And if you really spend it the right way, I'm sure you could actually get some Republicans and some more conservative people on board by saying that it's literally a defensive national position because we are weak as a country during the pandemic. If you want to make that call for unity, use it for something good instead of just lip service. Furthermore, if we're going to start trying to actually fix the pandemic, start by making sure every American has access to health care. Make sure they have Medicare to cover everyone, and make that part of an emergency executive order or relief bill that gets passed through. Make sure you go full nuclear and have the entire Senate make sure that McConnell can't get his way. You can easily implement this stuff. You have the House, you have the Senate, and it's going to take time for the Supreme Court to try to stop you. It's the same thing FDR did, and it needs to happen now. Expand medical coverage to everyone. You want your first 100 days to be an actual legacy of change and good? I don't think he does, but if you actually did, that's the first thing to start with, so people don't have to worry about going to the hospital or going to a doctor. And furthermore, funnel all of the money to making sure that those hospitals and doctors have enough resources to take care of people during this pandemic. Furthermore, implement a full national shutdown and implement UBI to subsidize everybody's income. Make businesses across the board shut down, and in their place, people will get some sort of UBI to replace their money, and will make people safe and secure financially. If a few poor people get a little bit money than they had before, so be it. But a UBI is something we should be dealing with anyway because of the job crisis and everything else in this country. So, furthermore, I think we need to freeze mortgages and rent and shut all debt across the board. Freeze all debt. Don't just pay the lip service of we're going to freeze, the mortgage payments until blah, 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 blah. Or we're going to stop the payments having to come in and just put a eviction moratorium. Actually freeze the payments. Stop them. Make them zeros. Set them to zero from here going out, at the very least. If not, back pay it. Make sure, if you really want to do it, provide the funding and resources for landlords and for banks. I don't think banks are really going to suffer that much. I don't think landlords are going to suffer all that much. Maybe a few. But at the end of the day, people living is much more valuable, and you can take up any immediate, grievance cases as they come up. Focus on saving lives first, because that should be the priority of what government is trying to do. And as for the debt, freeze it also, because, credit card payments, anything like that, you're getting all this interest accumulating, and people are struggling and suffering, and there's no way to pay it back. There are not enough positions. So just make sure that people are not getting more stress and debt, that they have food and they have money and resources. These type of procedures have worked well in other countries. You can justify it as part of being the defense spending budget. And even if you get full pushback from Republicans, which you're probably going to get regardless, this will be a beneficial movement. And it'll actually do this. And probably the main reason why they won't do it is because if you give people this now, people will start questioning, well, why can't we have this all the time? And that's what they're really afraid of. More than losing American lives, they are afraid of the possibility that a lot of people could become aware that this is quite possible and not nearly as expensive as they think it is. So, to wrap it up, I think that after all of this, if we actually do get through the pandemic, one of Biden's first goals should be to invest full-fold into hospital infrastructure and better distribution models in the future. Because this pandemic has been an absolute nightmare. We don't have a good distribution system. We are federally disjointed in this regard. And for the federal government to be disjointed on a distribution model for a vaccine seems like the one area that it really should be, taking charge and actually doing its job. I mean, it can crack down on so many different things. it can handle so many other responsibilities, but you can't handle distribution during a pandemic. And I get it, it's a difficult process, but we should have been having these procedures implemented years ago. With that said, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my Discord in the description down below. My name is Anarchist Tara, and I hope you enjoyed watching.